Hello, everybody, and welcome to the BAPT webinar. I'm Richard Owen, the current Treasurer and a Trustee of the BAPT. That's the British Association for Psychological Type. We're a charity who exists to promote knowledge and best practice with psychological type. And today I'm interviewing Roy Childs, who is a chartered occupational psychologist. He's got over 30 years experience in the field. He runs a business called Team Focus, does consulting work. He produces many different ability and personality assessments, training, and a whole host of other things. We're really happy to have him here. He's a long-standing member of the BAPT as well. So welcome, Roy. Hello, how are you doing?
Very well, thank you. Richard, everyone can hear me okay, I hope?
Yeah, loud and clear. And just going to get straight into some of these initial questions really about your career. You know, you've got a long-standing career in psychology. Just wondering, like, you know, what sort of work do you do currently with your company, and what sort of strands of business are you into right now?
Well, what's interesting about psychology, it can be so broad. And when I look at the things that I'm involved with, I mean, some of it is highly analytical work. You know, it's been validation work for the, you know, for air crew selection, for example. But it's also very sort of intimate work, you know, individual coaching. We've done quite a lot more in career guidance recently as well, with schools and with universities. But the shift in focus has been much more towards developing tools that maybe challenge or take sort of the psychometric world a bit further along from where I think it's got stuck. So, I mean, I feel I've got a fairly broad range of activities, and some of them have been BPS roles, like I'm a consultant editor for the test review process, for example. So I know the sort of the criteria pretty well, but I'm quite critical of them as well.
So you're just saying a bit about where psychometrics may have got stuck. Can you give us a little bit more insight into what you mean in that area?
I think that when we look at it historically, the psychometric model was built around measuring abilities. And then that was sort of brought across into measuring all the other, you know, the personality, motivation, etc. And the methodology is not entirely appropriate, and there hasn't been enough adaptation or understanding of how the, you know, the psychometric traditional model is for a less dynamic content of material. And so it sort of has restrained itself, restricted itself, I think, in many ways.
How have you tried to address some of that in your own instruments that you've created as well?
Well, it's like everything. You know, you need a bridge from the present to the future, so you can't go too far. So we do develop things with many of the psychometric sort of traditional indices, but that does not mean that that is the best way of evaluating tools that are there. And so I often say, really, that the big problem that psychometric has got is it overemphasizes measurement and underemphasizes the psychology. I think that we're missing a trick in the psychology of our understanding of things like personality, and that we need to rethink that in the way in which the greats used to, as we talked earlier. You know, when you look at the great now Jung, let's talk about Jung, you really get the sense he wanted to understand the human condition. I challenge anyone to say that that is what we get from all the people, the authors of the new instruments that are coming out now. Where do you see that curiosity about who people are and what drives them and how it works, as opposed to applying a model, giving you some numbers and norming them very often?
And one of your instruments is the TDI, which is a psychological type instrument. You know, using Jungian type theory, it's in some ways similar to the MBTI, I guess, in that it uses the sort of dichotomies. But I know that you've had it accredited as a BPS instrument, accredited instrument as well. It's quite unique in the type field. So how have you approached it differently to other type instruments?
The thing with the TDI, as I said, you build a bridge from where you are. And so in developing a type tool that would take people away from what I call the rigidification of type, I know that most of the BAPT community will be very clear that type is not a rigid, it is a dynamic model, but overlaying it is a questionnaire that leads people into it. And to be frank, I think the training often leads people there as well. That whole thing about I am a type, I am an INFP is very rigidifying in a lot of ways. And then drive the nail into the coffin by saying, and now let's get to best fit type. Let's make sure you are one of those. Whereas what we're doing with the type mapping system is recognizing that we are, well, first of all, preference is a very difficult concept. What is a preference? I often joke with would you rather have diarrhea or constipation? It's not an easy choice. And when you think about the choices that we have, what we prefer, the fact that people will often say it depends, that is often trivialized, but it shouldn't be trivialized because of course it depends. And one of the things that it depends on is it depends on where I am. If I'm in a swimming pool, I'd rather swim than drown. If I'm in an ESTJ organization, most people would prefer to be more like that type than not. Now, obviously, there are some types who like to be the complete opposite. They like to be the maverick, etc. But the context is hugely important, and context has been ignored. In fact, the very first chapter in Jerome Kagan's book, Psychologist Ghosts, is missing context. And he criticizes psychology for over-focusing on what goes on inside the individual without enough understanding of the conditions in which that operates. And fundamental to all of that is the need to therefore begin to tease out and separate the difference between preference and sort of what goes on inside the me, the sense of identity that I have, and the context that I have. And I call it the difference between being and doing. Okay? Who I am, I do not just get that from what I do, because my context will determine a lot of what I do, and it may limit who I think I am or who I actually am. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think what we're getting a sense of there, is the separation between some sort of inner preference of who, which is driving us to be a certain way, and then the behavior as it's expressed on the outside. And I think defining that relationship between those things, at least for me, is part of the real key of type, and to trying to develop it to be more clear. Would you agree that that's something you're kind of addressing with what you do?
Well, yes. I worked with Steve Myers on this, and we developed the type mapping system because he was particularly keen on behavioral manifestations and what people actually did in teams, and developed the MTRI, which was a behavioral model based on Jung. And we combined them and built the type mapping system. And in simple summary, it says, look, let's think about what goes on the inside, and the type TDI takes that a step beyond the MBTI, in that it doesn't just say, what's your preference? And you have to plug for it. And if you can't decide, think of yourself at home with your slippers on, which is another thing which I find rather limiting. Really, you want people to identify with the things that are important and valuable to them. So to stick them at home with their slippers on and maybe with a pipe in their mouth is possibly not doing that. So I say, let's not do that. Let's give people a chance to report what is most you. When you feel most you, whether that's alive or relaxed or meditating or walking across the hills, the people should choose that. And then separating that preference. Richard, you probably would like to be a good, tidy boy, not with that mess around you all around. Where might that, I mean, I don't know if that's true, Richard, but
I'm pretty tidy, but you know.
but wherever that comes from, it could well be your parents' preference. Okay. And when we think about preference, it is so involved. I mean, I've got a different mindset. By preference, is it what makes me comfortable? Is it what makes me positively comfortable, or is it what doesn't make me uncomfortable? Is it a view that I have of myself, which I often call it the outdated stereotype, because I caught myself at that, reporting, oh, what do you like, Roy? And I'd say something, and I had forgotten to update what I was really like now rather than I had been. You know, or sometimes preference is the yearnings within. The person I think is in there, but I've never allowed it to come out. I mean, isn't preference complicated?
Yeah.
You just wash it into a home with the slippers on is a travesty.
It's an interesting analogy, right? It's an analogy for some sort of more natural state that it's trying to tap into, but it's maybe not. I think you're right that we need to be more explicit about what is the phenomena of experience that we're trying to actually tap into.
Yeah.
You know, it's and using a sort of analogy like shoes off, smoking jacket, pipe in mouth is not always. I'm not saying that that's the actual. I'm exaggerating it, but you know what I mean. It's not helpful, is it, necessarily?
No. Well, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I use the concept of the four selves as a way of helping people with that. So basically saying, look, there's my contextual self, and that is quite varied. You know, I can actually be a sort of well, my kids would say maybe an autocratic father, but I'm a laissez-faire manager, for example. Okay, I can have these different parts of me. I do things in different contexts in different ways. You know, and to be honest, we're all capable of quite a deal of flexibility like that. So I talk about the contextual self, but then I talk about the identity self, because behind every one of these contexts or roles that I play, there's a sense of what is really me. And the identity self is really what preference is trying to get at. But as I was indicating earlier, that's still such a mismatch of different things, because what is my sense of identity? And that's why, you know, what we did, taken from, you know, Will Schutz and the Firo, introducing this idea of saying my preference the way it is and my preference the way I want. And what has been so liberating about that is that it has 3/4 of the population report different types with those two mindsets. You've immediately blown away the get into the box, which one are you? You have got into the internal dialogue, the question, who am I? Because ultimately, that is what we are asking people in any of this. They're saying, who are you? And we are stimulating curiosity, because there's probably never an end to that question, but there's an evolving story. So I use the metaphor of the story. We're all evolving stories, and we are trying to report the current chapter of my book. And yet, very often, especially in questionnaires, especially when they say, well, give the first answer that comes to you, I'm giving you chapter one. I'm giving you what I always say, as opposed to where I am now. So I think there is a great responsibility when we use these to say, look at yourself now, be more reflective. Think about where you really are now. Now answer. What I find is that is want question opens up a dialogue which gets at the uncertainty within. And there is uncertainty within all of us. Now, sometimes people yearn for certainty, and I think that's why MBTI has been so successful, because in that debate, finding a certainty is very comforting, but limiting. And so it's a resting place for a while, but how do you go on from that? And most of the people in the BAPT community will recognize all of that and say, well, we get them into that home, find out, and then we move. But so little, I think, is done on the idea that, you know, we don't just then remain our type forever and do little excursions into trying different things. You know, if we go back to Jung, the talk I gave back a couple of years ago, which is about transcendence. Ultimately, we come to know the different parts of ourselves and they separate and then coalesce, and we become, and ultimately, Jung believed that type became irrelevant. The types that he described, that we transcended those. And that is not something I see a great deal of within the type community. You know, type is almost, you've got to get to true type. And that's what I find so, that in itself is an approach which encourages unification. And that's what we're trying to get away from. So with type mapping, give people the MPRI and ask them to do it thinking of different contexts, and you immediately see how people recognize their own flexibility. You give them the TDI, and you give them, now, is there a core, a heart to that? And how does that feed into these different situations? And then doing the is want, you get into, but what are the pressures on you? You know, this want, that's a really important question. And if we think of the psychoanalytic roots of this, you know, people often think of Jung and Freud together. They're so different. Freud was about where I've come from, what happened to me, and let's understand that, because that's why I show up like this now. Whereas Jung was about, this is where I am now, but what am I becoming? So if you like, they've got completely opposite orientations. And that idea that we use this is want, the want is part of that story. What am I becoming? And that in itself is not simple. The story, which I may have told you before, Richard, which is the woman who was completely opposite on her is and her want, using the TDI. She said to me, Roy, I'm not that unhappy. What does this mean? And I said, I don't know what it means. But let's consider it. And after a good couple of hours, she came up with the classic, which is, Roy, I've got it. What I want is not what I want. And her want wasn't her own want, it was her want for success. And her model of success was built around a range of behaviors that she thought led to success, but which meant, when described in personality terms, was not the person she wanted to be. That was critical in her conceptualization of what the story was that she was telling herself. I don't actually want that. What do I really want? So again, the want does not necessarily point the future that I want to become. It is exploring the story I'm telling myself so that it can be unpicked and I can be freed from some of the things that I'm not conscious of at the moment.
It's fascinating. Yeah, you're right. Like seeing that separation between environmental pressures and conscious desires and underlying predispositions and the context of development and the story of life unfolding. And that's, you know, there's so much to that, like you said, that I think without viewing type within that context, we've lost entirely what it is. And it's great to hear you as an expert who's got this experience with type talking about issues with type, your own criticisms of it and how it's been implemented in the past. I'm curious now to move on to, like, well, people who don't have that kind of experience and maybe have heard and seen things online about types and seen criticisms of it, you know, how do you see criticisms from other people about type who maybe don't see these complexities that you've seen about it? Like, how do they stack up?
Well, a worldview I have at the moment, Richard, is that we are in a period of a flight to the superficial. That we are, I mean, the world has actually got more complex, and the reaction has been to try and make it as simple as possible. I mean, Brexit's a good example, isn't it?
Oh dear.
Remain or leave. Okay. Don't go there.
Dangerous territory. But yeah, as long as it's a non-political point.
A non-political point. It is about how you can frame things in a very simple way, which hide the complexities underneath. And I think that, you know, the way type is used has done that. Oh, get a type. The complexities underneath. And this flight to the superficial, I mean, I don't deny that, as I said earlier, people who have got sort of a lot of uncertainty sometimes yearn for a simplistic, capturing. And I've seen people really sort of come together with, oh, understanding, I'm a whatever it is, and that's really helpful when they are in the uncertainty period. But it's like everything. It's, Jung was so good at this sort of idea of the dynamic tensions of opposites. So when I'm in chaos, I want certainty. When I've got certainty, I need to recreate chaos. And I think what we're not doing with type is being comfortable with recreating the chaos.
Yeah, and that's with the developmental difference in so many pathways and possibilities for how you express your personality in the context of your type.
Yeah. But coming back to your question about the criticisms, I mean, I do get annoyed by the simplicity of the criticisms, and most of those because they are there's not enough breadth in the understanding of what they're doing. So academic psychology has been very damning of type. I mean, I would guess that 95% of academic psychologists just disregard type and the MBTI. Certainly, we see that. Now, why is that? And one of the reasons for that is that there is a huge bias in academia towards extroverted thinking. And if you like, and so the scientific approach, an extroverted thinking approach to understanding the world has been hugely useful, but is limited, and not recognizing that it is only one lens. And that's where I think that, we can parallel Jung's personal development himself, because he really wanted to be a scientist and he really saw himself as a scientist, but his understanding about how that became more limiting, and that was part of his break with Freud as well, was recognizing that Freud was trying to establish psychoanalysis as an evidence-based science, and his own turmoil led him to realize it's not as simple as that. So I think the criticisms that the academic world have of that comes from a simplistic lens and not acknowledging that there are more ways to understanding the universe than what is probably a limited view of science. I mean, you're a physicist and you know how...
Well, chemistry was my original subject, but yeah, I'm very much interested in physics as well. And then, yeah.
So, there is also the sort of the energy behind the criticism, which is in itself telling a story. It's like people are locked into their own sort of, projections or whatever in all of this. But the idea that type and trait is one of the things. And I talk to psychologists who are so committed to the trait idea because they see it as, you can be anywhere on that scale. You're not one or the other. And yet I can completely turn that on its head and say, well, actually, so you score 7 on extroversion, you've rigidified it around that point on the scale. Whereas if you use type properly, you are saying, but look, you're both and you're dynamically interplaying these, and there's a much more flexible way to thinking about type than often there is about trait. Both are useful. So I use the analogy from physics. Wave theory and quantum theory both shed light on our understanding of the universe, and type and trait both shed light on our understanding of the human condition in a limited way. So, I think embracing both, which brings me back to Brexit, which is that instead of having this shouting match, but, I'm right, you're wrong sort of thing, we should have more respect for the two sides of the argument and try and understand it more. And behind that is a greater respect for trying to understand who we are, what this whole thing called psychology really is, because we still are a little way from understanding the human being.
I think what you're saying about the approaches to science, and I think around the time Jung was doing his work, you also have behaviorism as a sort of movement in psychology that really impacted it all the way through to the modern day. And I mean, is that kind of what you mean, or the mindset with which we approach science and what it includes and what it excludes?
Yeah, but I also find that there is that sort of attempt to be rigorous, and it's not there. So one of the things that is this thing about, we think about behaviorism, as you were talking about there, and then we think about how that leading into the development of questionnaires. Should questionnaires really ask about behavior? Now, when you look at all the personality questionnaires, they are a mishmash of behavior, attitude, motivation, preference, etc. And there is no clarity about what we're doing. And that's why I'm saying I think there should be more of an understanding of what precedes the thing that we're operationalizing. Mm-hmm. And for me, that thing is about trying to separate the idea of being and doing. Because what we do is not who we are. What I do if I'm in a refugee camp, what I do if I'm in my work context, I mean, all of those are extracting elements from me, but they are not what I am. Many people are limited by their context. And to therefore say that is the sum of you, your behavior is the sum of you as a person, I think is very unfair. Which is why I love the Isabel's break from that tradition and saying, let's look at preference. And even going as far as the word pairs to free people up a lot more to get at something less tangible that had meaning and resonance. And I think that is her greatest contribution in the idea of personality measurement and questionnaire. Because in fact, I mean, the MBTI to me is not the best operationalization of the Jungian model because it misses so much. It rigidifies. And some of the weaknesses in there, I mean, have you studied the items in the EI scale on MBTI? It's entirely about sociability or intimacy. It's all about people, which is why it correlates highly with all the other extroversion things. But it shouldn't, because it's not about people. It's a different thing. How did Isabella allow her questionnaire to be so distorted in the measurement of that dimension? I don't know. And I only discovered this because I was confused by the people that I was giving feedback to and recognizing actually they're not extrovert, but they do like people. Oh, and that's how I sort of, it was experience that showed me some of the limitations of what we're doing. But people don't look into these, or they criticize these things for the wrong reasons. I criticize MBTI, certainly, but not for the reasons that people give, not because it doesn't have a bimodal distribution. I mean, that is a complete fallacy. That is how you would identify whether there are two opposites. And I've done exercises that demonstrate that. And yet you find it in academic textbooks. It's as if some of the academics haven't even given thought to the way in which this model should and could be operationalized.
So yeah, the fundamental differences in the way that type looks at personality, and that's driving these misunderstandings. What other misunderstandings do you see in the criticisms that come out from various places?
Well, I think one of the big ones is this rigidity, flexibility thing, and recognizing. I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because one of the things that the psychometric model wants to do is to overimpose a consistency in style over time as a way of saying this is a good instrument. So it is, in a way, denying the idea of the Jungian model, which is about evolution, change, and transcendence. Okay, but so then that's sort of the criticism that it is not reliable enough, not consistent enough, doesn't monitor change enough, is one of the things that I find sort of objectionable in it. But the biggest thing as well around that is the idea that we have not taken into account context. We need to allow people the reality that we all experience, that sometimes, I mean, I always use the example of one of my relatives who is a shy person, really. But you know, there are times when she loves the limelight, you know, and the way in which, you know, in different contexts, people can change and different parts of them come out. So this idea that we are like MRI scans and this stimulus will stimulate this part of me, that stimulus will stimulate this part of me, and I will show up differently in different places. We need to recognize that, and behind that are these things about the inner self and this sense of who I am. And I sort of have built this idea of how we are potentially, we ought to think of ourselves like bongo drums. We are all bongo. And what is a bongo drum? It can sit there on the shelf and it can look very nice, but it doesn't do anything. And then something happens, it gets banged and you hear a sound. The context, the sound, the bashing of it. And what sound does it give? And that will depend on the size of it, the size of the material it's made of, etc. And all of these things, in the end, how context influences what I do and how I feel will be my aspirations, my motivations, all these things. And I would like to, I've got a little model on this if you wanted to see it.
Yeah, well, just one thought though. I was thinking about the analogy of the bongo drum. I get that context. Although the difference is the bongo drum doesn't necessarily have an inner self, which is kind of what you were saying was really key to all of this, and that, you know, that subjective experience of what is natural to oneself is kind of, you know, picking apart all of these contexts and these things. But it's like, but what was true to this inner self?
Well, you see, what I'm thinking is that we ought to be talking a lot more, rather than just about personality, is the multiple strands that combine to give me my sense of identity. Okay? And those multiple strands involve my values, my aspirations, my behaviors, my reactions to stress. All of these things are things that build this thing about who I am. And because I find that the sort of, you know, the definition of personality is inadequate, you know, and, you know, that we are all these different things, that reconceiving it could be a useful thing to do.
Yes, so definitely. So let's think about the next question being, in terms of criticisms, like from academic psychology of type, what do you think is a fair criticisms? What do you think that really we need to take on board and do something about?
Well, I don't know if this comes a great deal from academic psychology, but the MBTI is not the best operationalization of Jung. And I think that, I mean, if you look at Steve Meyer's book on this, where he's looking at, you know, MBTI versus Jungian individuation and how they separate, he makes a fairly strong case for saying the MBTIs diverge quite strongly from Jung. Some of the other things that are probably sort of legitimate is that the MBTI is probably over sort of emphasized or not sufficiently clarified the idea of personality and the way in which then that we need to rethink about roles and behaviors and identity, etc. So, you know, in terms of fair criticisms, most of them I think are unfair criticisms, to be honest. is criticizing type for the wrong things through not understanding what the basic model is. And a lot of that comes from the fact that it's, the academic world is empirically driven. Academic psychology is empirically driven. And a very strong strand in what we're doing here is saying that this is a theory-driven thing. And if you do not agree with Jungian theory, you're not going to like what comes out of attempts to operationalize it. But if you do see some value in the theory, then you can get into a more interesting discussion and debate about, how well it's been done and how it opens the door into that theory itself.
And if you think as well that behavioural aspect versus the inner self, I'm picking back up on you saying that again, because I think that's quite important to only the person knows internally whether the behaviours they're displaying are ultimately fitting for them. And that's kind of, for me, what type's about, I guess, and that, I don't know if, I think that's kind of where you're coming from as well with this, that there's, but making it clear that that's different from where the academic models come from typically. And it's all about ultimately subjectivity and phenomenology as a way of understanding the mind and the human personality versus a very much more objectively verifiable way, which is a difficult thing to reconcile.
Yes, I think, if I've got you right in what you're saying there, Richard, it's the question of what is the purpose of what we're trying to do here? And for many of the sort of academic orientations, it is about using this to predict behavior. That is often seen as the gold standard. And obviously ignoring context and the flexibility means that there's a big hole in that whole process anyway. But I was taught very early on by being a psychologist and having twins. I am sort of able to do my own experiments, you see. And when the two boys, when we first took them to nursery, I would characterize one as more extrovert than the other. In fact, the other as being pretty introverted. I don't know if they're going to watch this, but anyway, one of them is pretty introverted, one of them much more extroverted. My prediction was that when we first went to nursery, the extrovert would love the buzz and run into it, and the introvert would find it too much. We went, and the opposite happened. Basically, the more extroverted one was so overawed by the amount of activity that was going on, he held back. Whereas Ben, the other one, looked around, shut it all out, saw what he wanted, which was the tractor over the other side, walked over, started playing with it. So, and the message I got from that was that actually understanding their type or their personality was not about predicting, but it was about understanding the experience that they were having. It helped me to understand that Ben, who, he could be reading his book with World War III going on around him. He's able to shut these things out enormously. It doesn't mean he's not outward looking and social. He's actually a very socially skilled introvert. But it was that, so moving from wanting prediction to wanting understanding. And that's where we started this whole conversation. I feel that, that curiosity and wanting to understand rather than to measure and to predict is the direction that I would like to see more over the coming years.
Yeah, that's great. And just one more question, I guess, before we wrap up. What does the future hold for psychological type? And what could be done to ensure that the benefits that it can offer may be sustained ongoing in the future of psychology?
Well, I suppose it's a bit reiterating what I've said, is that if we can stimulate curiosity rather than have this style of debate which we see of I'm right, you're wrong, as I say, it's pervading society generally now, but reintroduce the idea of curiosity, and we have to acknowledge that people are far more complicated than any of these models, okay? And therefore, we need to shift the lens on that and allow people to question, debate, etc., etc. So where is it going? Is that the direction in which it's going? I don't feel it is at the moment. I don't think that, and part of that is because there is not, you know, an acknowledgement of the time that is needed to devote to these things. I mean, our training courses have gone from 5 days to 3 days to 1 day. You know, we are trying to do everything quicker, and can't we just do it online, etc. And so what we need is, again, something I got from Will Schutz. He said, if it's going slow, slow down. You know, the idea that we should recognize that these things are not quick fixes, that reflection is a slow art, not a quick art, and that will lead to greater understanding in time.
That's wonderful. I think that's a great, poignant place to leave it on, and I do hope that people watching this can take from that, and we can help to build things as a community, and other people will take that forward. So thank you, Roy. That's brilliant, and lovely speaking with you again. Look forward to seeing you at hopefully the BAPT conference in April. Are you going to be there in 2020?
I've submitted a paper which is exploring type without using questionnaires.
Excellent. Well, I hope they'll get to see you present that then. So yeah, look forward to that. Hopefully everybody will be releasing more information about the conference in the next month or two. Thanks to everyone who's joined us, and to everyone who's listening to the recording. And take care. We'll see you at another webinar next time. Thanks very much.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye then.